I read this book earlier this year, Threat Multiplier. As an Air Force veteran turned environmentalist, my interest was piqued. However, I was very disappointed to find out that this author doesn't really talk about how the military is contributing to climate change. She's very pro-military, doesn't want to see the military go anywhere. The military, particularly the US military, needs to care about climate change. Because climate change is much more than warmer temperatures. It's already creating and will create more climate refugees, it starts famines, it starts wars, and so much more. Climate change is truly a threat to us all. But honestly, the most interesting thing that I learned in this book was how big of an impact 9/11 had on climate policy in the US. Prior to 9/11, the government was relatively green, and that's Republicans and Democrats. And in the 90s too, the Department of Defense budget was at its lowest ever, and the military was kind of going green too. But George Bush dropped most of the climate efforts in the United States for the global war on terror. The government once again became pointedly focused on land grabs, oil claims, and things like that, at the expense of people and the planet. To be clear, I am not praising nor will I praise any government that we are going to talk about in this post before Bush Jr. They could have taken many more measures for the planet. I get that. But today, let's talk about the history of US climate policy starting in the 1960s. Don't worry, we're not going to go all the way back to the beginning. And keep in mind, I'm going to try to keep it very brief. It's hard to succinctly capture 50 years of climate policy, but let's get into it. Hello everyone, it's Emma and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all sorts of things zero waste, focusing on free, easy, and fun ways to live low waste. And today, we're talking about how 9/11 kind of ruined environmentalism in the US. Let's start with Lyndon B. Johnson. Serving from 1963 to 1969, he was a Democrat, and we start with him because he was kind of the very first modern environmentalist president. In 1965, LBJ got a scientific report about all of the state of our climate to include atmospheric carbon dioxide and man-made climate change. This chart illustrates climate predictions from this report, and sadly, it was very accurate. At that time, in 1965, they had the evidence of climate change, they knew what to do to stop it, and they didn't stop it. During his term, he signed into law 300 conservation measures, give or take, and this truly paved the way for the first Earth Day in 1970. Learn more about the first Earth Day in this video. But we cannot ignore his role in the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, this does really overshadow every single thing that he did, no matter how good, on the US front, because guess what? War is bad for the planet no matter where you're doing the war. So that moves us to 1969 through 1974, Richard Nixon. He served one term, got reelected, served 1 year, did Watergate, and then resigned. So did Nixon do anything for the planet? Surprisingly, yes. I was blown away at what Nixon created. Did he do this out of the goodness of his heart? Like, did he actually believe that climate change was important? Maybe, maybe not. But what really happened in the 1970s was the rise of the modern environmental movement, the first Earth Day, and things like that. So really, he had to act because it was the popular thing to do at the time. So he took it very seriously, and here's some things that we learned from the National Archive. He recognized huge political power in environmentalism. The Nixon administration and Congress initiated many of the most important and enduring environmental policies in the US, to include the signing of the National Environmental Policy, NEPA, of 1970, which Trump is trying to abolish, signing the Clean Air Act of 1970, which Trump and his EPA are trying to abolish. He signed the Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1969 and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. He established the Council of Environmental Quality in 1969, established the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, which is now headed up by Lee Zeldin, a prominent climate denier, and he established the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, in 1970. But yes, my guesses were correct. Records show that his public policy and what he thought behind closed doors did not really align. He really did not care about fighting for climate change. He only did it because it was popular. And honestly, I don't care. I wish it was still the case to this day that even Republicans would fight for climate change because it is the popular thing to do, no matter how they feel about it personally. But alas, here we are. It is now a bipartisan issue. But let's keep going. Let's see if we can pinpoint when it became bipartisan. This brings us to Gerald Ford from 1974 to 1977. He was also a Republican. He was Nixon's vice president. He took the office once Nixon stepped down. But did Gerald Ford continue this climate legacy? So in 1973, right before Gerald Ford took office, the US was hit with the OPEC oil embargo. Just a little tidbit about this. In 1973, October 6, 1973, Israel and the Arab states were at war with one another. And basically all of the Arab nations controlled the oil from the Middle East. And so they said, hey, if anybody supports Israel, we're gonna put an oil embargo on you. This raised the price of oil 4 times. And in response, when Gerald Ford took office, he, quote, advocated for more fuel-efficient vehicles and encouraged the development of alternative energy sources. This set the stage for the response of subsequent administrations to the impact of climate change. Additionally, he did a lot to prioritize energy efficiency in homes, businesses, corporations, schools, the government, and was a big proponent of public transportation. In fact, he signed the National Mass Transportation Assistance Act of 1974, which authorized nearly $12 billion to public transportation. Again, did he do this because he cared about the planet, or did he do this because of the state of the oil crisis in the US? But regardless, it is a positive thing for the planet. Moving on to Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981. He he was a Democrat. Still in 1977, we were faced with these oil embargoes 4 years later, so he was worried about this economically, politically, and environmentally, especially as in 1979, the Iranian Revolution began, and then in 1980, the Iraq-Iran War started. So all of this paired with a memo that he got from the Presidential Science Advisor. So Carter set a hefty goal of getting the US to be run off of 20% renewable energy by 2000. So that gave him, from the end of his term, about 20 years. And this was not met. Surprise, surprise. So to help Americans take this goal seriously and show that he was also doing stuff personally, he put solar panels on the roof of the White House. But these were removed by our next president, Ronald Reagan. More on him next. Though, as we've already seen, previous presidents before Carter made very similar initiatives for the planet. But for some reason, when Carter did it, it was a sign of weakness. And he was constantly belittled for these actions, which honestly led to his demise in the following election. But he did do a few more great things for the planet, to include creating the Department of Energy in 1977 for energy research and regulations, establishing the Solar Energy Research Institute, now called the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, in 1977, and in 1978 he introduced the National Energy Act to tax gas-guzzling cars while providing financial incentives for investments in wind and solar energy. And many of these were reversed by our next guy, Ronald Reagan. And if you know anything about me, you know that I hate Ronald Reagan, because he did in fact ruin everything. I've got a full video linked in the blog post from Legia Miller, the creator of these stickers, down below, on why Reagan in fact ruined everything, to include climate policy. It is at this point in my research where I realized, oh, actually 9/11 didn't ruin climate policy and environmentalism, it was Ronald Reagan. He paved the way, and George Bush really took advantage of this dismantling of this partisan issue in 2001 after the terrorist attacks, and he ran with it. So Reagan walked so that all of the following subsequent Republican presidents after him could run. We're not even going to talk about Trump in this video. If you want more on Trump and his climate policy and how he's ruining the planet, you can check out this video for now, but also let me know down below if you want me to do a future video on Trump as the days tick by. Anyway, Ronald Reagan served 2 terms as a Republican from 1981 to 1989. And I have to give him one bit of credit. It hurts me to do so. He fixed the hole in the ozone. That was Reagan. Well, it wasn't Reagan, but you know what I mean. Dozens of countries met in September of 1987 to discuss this problem, and Reagan took it seriously. By 1989, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer officially entered into force. NOAA estimates that the Montreal Protocol prevented between 0.5 and 1 degrees Celsius of global warming by 2100. But truly that is all the good that I can give Reagan credit for. The early Reagan administration launched an overt attack on the EPA, much like what Trump is doing right now. This was deregulation, budget cuts, and mass firings. Up to 30% of employees at the EPA were fired at the time. He went against popular conservative climate policy at the time and instead went with that of the Heritage Foundation. Sound familiar? Once again, that's exactly who's backing Trump. And Reagan broke precedent here. Instead of appointing cabinet heads that had worked in the federal government that were highly qualified, he picked his friends. Again, just like what Trump is doing. So the EPA nomination was Ann Gorsuch, a corporate lawyer who opposed the Clean Air Act, water quality rules, and hazardous waste protections. She cut EPA staff by 21% in their first term and slashed their budget. Between the fiscal years 1980 and 1983 under Gorsuch, EPA's operating budget fell 27% and the science budget for the federal government tumbled 58%. There's more to get into. Of course, Reagan ruined everything, but I'll keep it brief. Reagan was extremely anti-science, extremely anti-establishment, and very anti-climate, which makes our next president, who was vice president to Reagan, a very interesting discussion. That brings us to George H.W. Bush, George Sr., who served just 1 term from 1989 to 1993 and was a Republican. Bush Sr. was rather pro-planet, publicly. Many sources say, once again, he was not very pro-planet behind closed doors, but he wanted to remain popular. And again, I don't care how climate policy gets done, as long as it gets done. So in 1990, Bush held a White House summit on the science and economics of global change, aka climate change. In a 1989 letter to Congress, the White House wrote that scientists at the time warned that temperatures could rise 10 to 50 times faster than anything in recorded history if humans continued to burn fossil fuels. He also continued work on the ozone layer, which was only just now starting to heal in the early 90s, and turned his focus to acid rain, which was becoming a very big problem for humans, plants, animals, crops, and people from all sorts of political parties were concerned about. Ugh. Yeah, I forgot he did this. This makes me mad. So in order to combat acid rain, he wanted to have a cap on sulfur dioxide emissions, with a goal of reducing this cap over time, therefore reducing emissions over time. Instead of imposing specific sulfur dioxide reducing procedures and technologies on companies, President Bush proposed the creation of a national emissions market for utilities in which they could buy and sell pollution rights. This is essentially saying that if a company is wealthy enough, they can pollute as much as they are willing to pay. And interestingly enough, because his son was so pro-oil, Bush Sr. enacted the Energy Policy Act of 1992. This act sought to encourage the use of ethanol, hydrogen, biodiesel, and electricity as alternative fuel sources. Around the same time, he signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and he went to the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Here, he even gave remarks about protecting the planet, and following this, he established the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which coordinates federal research on climate change and its impacts. So now, let's get into 1993 to 2001 with Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat. How many presidents do we have that were just defined by just one singular event? Because I'm sure you know what I'm talking about when I say Bill Clinton. But let's ignore that and talk about what he thought about climate change. So here are a few key points. I got these from the National Archives, and I think they were current as of 2001, so keep that in mind. He strengthened the Safe Drinking Water Act, which honestly sounds kind of like the bare minimum. It requires America's 55,000 water utilities to provide regular reports to their customers on the quality of their drinking water. A win is a win. It's kind of sad that that's a win. He aimed to reduce harmful emissions of smog-causing nitrogen oxides and particulate matter from heavy-duty trucks and diesel fuels by over 90% for the sake of clean skies and clean air. He initiated the cleanup of 3 times the amount of Superfund sites as any previous administration. And if you've never heard the term Superfund site, here's a quick definition. I would love to cover this in a full video if there's interest. He mandated that companies report what toxins they release into the environment. And again, all of this is like the bare minimum. Unfortunately, we have to count these as climate wins because of like how destructive the Reagan administration was. Again, I would have loved to see all of these administrations do far more than this, but like at least they did the bare minimum. Anyway, the last thing that Bill Clinton did was enter the US into the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. But according to Threat Multiplier, the US military was exempt. And at the time, the US military used 72% of US energy, and they were exempt. And the Kyoto Protocol is just essentially a bunch of countries coming together in Kyoto, Japan, and saying, hey, let's hold each other accountable, let's reduce emissions, let's make the planet better. It's more for show. I don't know if it was actually like legitimate policy. And regardless, if the US military, the biggest polluter in the US, is exempt, it's kind of meaningless. We're into 2001. It's time for George Bush Jr. Serving 2 terms through 2009, he was a Republican. And before we get into the global war for oil, I mean the global war on terror, let's see if Bush Jr. did anything good for the planet on the home front during his term. Because again, engaging in a war is not environmentally friendly, especially as we just discussed the environmental impact of the US military, which you can learn more about in full in this video. So some pros. He did enact the $1.2 billion hydrogen fuel initiative and the Freedom Car program aimed at reducing carbon emissions from vehicles and promoting energy independence. He launched the Generation 4 International Forum to advance nuclear energy as a cleaner alternative to fossil fuels, which I find this very interesting because like in the early 2000s, we really did enter like the new oil age. It was very interesting. He was like pro-nuclear. And if you want to learn more about nuclear energy and how it's actually the best form of fuel, you can check out this video next. And he also signed the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to balance energy independence with environmental goals to provide incentives for renewable energy, biofuels, and clean coal technologies. Some cons without even talking about the global war on terror. So he withdrew the US from the Kyoto Protocol very quickly. He withdrew in March 2001. He was not even 2 months into his term, and he said, yeah, let's get out of there. He also backed out on any climate policy promises that he made on the campaign trail. And I'm like, why would he even make campaign promises for the climate? That's weird. And then why would he back out of them? Especially because like at this time it's still not quite bipartisan, but it's like getting there. Remember who he ran against if you were not alive then. It was Al Gore. Al Gore, a very prominent environmentalist, especially for a politician. So if Al Gore is winning all the environmentalist votes and Bush is not, he had to win those moderate people by saying that he cared about the planet. So this would make sense why he backed out of these promises so quickly. And I'm sure we've all been waiting for it because it has impacted our climate policy still in 2025, that is lobbying and science denial. Reports emerged of political pressure on scientists to downplay the threat of global warming, edits to scientific documents, and suppression of key findings related to climate change. The administration's close ties to the fossil fuel industry and business lobbyists further fueled accusations of prioritizing economic and corporate interests over environmental concerns. Though many claim that he never took climate change seriously, like personally in his heart, he did start to change course slightly in his second term, which is weird because, you know, you can only serve 2 terms, so why would you want to be an environmental president all of a sudden? Perhaps it was because the public had started at this time to have such a bad taste in their mouth about the global war on terror and the US troops in the Middle East that he needed something to kind of redeem his character, I suppose, in his second term, so that way people would remember him for that instead of remember him for the global war on terror. But alas, nobody remembers him for his environmental stuff. And it could also be that he attended a summit in Scotland in 2005, right as he entered his second term, in which he was totally outnumbered by other leaders at the time who believed in climate science and who were trying to take climate change seriously. and he was like the only one who wasn't. So that probably also has something to do with it. All right, now we're backtracking. We're going back to 9/11, September 11th, 2001. So of course, the US is going to turn its attention to New York City and DC at this time. Priority number one in the immediate aftermath was safety and retaliation. So this turned into the Global War on Terror, or GWOT. So this encompassed on-the-ground wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also trade wars and diplomacy. The GWOT took any sort of priority that the US government had about climate change and threw it out the window, not even on the back burner. It's gone. If you're interested in any history about the GWOT, to include the history of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Kuwait, I have some resources that I will leave tagged in the blog post for this video. Oh my gosh, I learned so much. It is blowing my mind. We were not taught, especially like I grew up in a post 9/11 world where I was like in school post 9/11. I didn't learn any of this. I didn't learn any of the truth of these countries, why they do the things that they do. This information is very interesting, very worthy of your time, and really helps you understand the impact of 9/11 globally. Anyway, from the 90s to 2001, and obviously still to this day, the oil and gas industry has been sowing seeds of doubt about science, about climate change, and in 2001, this has been going on for at least a decade. So 9/11 was precisely the catalyst that big oil and the US government needed to prioritize fossil fuels and money over the people and the planet, and to continue to push an anti-science rhetoric. Not just anti-climate science, as we see to this day, anti-science in general. And I'm sure it doesn't help that defense contractors wanted their slice of the money pie back, because in the 90s, the defense budget shrunk by 38%. It hit its low in 1996 at $266 billion for the Department of Defense. That's still a lot of money. But don't you worry, as of 2025, it's at $962 billion, nearly $1 trillion. I expect it to get to $1 trillion under the Trump administration. Once again, I also want to note that the election itself in 2000 had a huge impact on climate policy, environmentalism, and things like that. And also wedging that divide between the political parties. Because up until now, both political parties ran on climate, but really Al Gore taking climate and making it like his most prominent thing, I think. Listen, I was alive but not conscious enough to understand this election. This is just all I know about Al Gore from like hearsay. But him being such a staunch environmentalist and Bush not caring at all about the planet was kind of the first nail in the coffin for driving that wedge and making climate change bipartisan. All right, let's talk a little bit about 9/11 propaganda. I couldn't find a whole lot of information out there on this, simply just because it's still pretty recent. Of course, the US government doesn't want us to know about their propaganda techniques. So I really need like word of mouth on what people at the time experienced in terms of propaganda. Again, I was alive, just not very conscious enough to understand. Anyway, tragedy will bring people together, and the US really capitalized on that. They took advantage of our shared trauma to foster patriotism, to use that as an excuse to go to war. And at first, the war was largely popular because of this shared trauma and everybody being hurt. This led to increased flag displays, increased unity amongst white Americans, support of the military, rampant Islamophobia and xenophobia, as well as just a broad disdain for immigrants. So you can see how this paved a very dangerous path for the Trump administration both times to just run amok. I'm not going to sit here and say that patriotism is fully bad, but when your patriotism revolves around hatred, that is bad. So this patriotism fueled by exploiting our shared trauma led to a huge boom in supporting military action, which led to an increased DoD budget, slowly at first, to $335 billion compared to the $266 billion from 1996, to an astounding $759 billion by the end of the Global War on Terror in 2021. But please keep in mind there are still 40,000 troops stationed in the Middle East, not necessarily in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in other parts of the Middle East, just kind of as a show of force, as a means of policing the Middle East, readiness, and things like that. So the US is still in the Middle East. Don't let them tell you they're not. So because at first there was such a big effort for this war, people really didn't care where their tax money was going. They didn't really care at first that it was inflating the DoD budget. And what I don't think enough people recognize is how the cycle of war and climate change is an endless cycle until we stop one of them, and that one of them should be war, because if we stop war, we can better stop climate change. But many conflicts, many wars stem from crises, and many crises start with the climate. Be it a flood, an extended drought, a famine, a hurricane, environmental disasters are getting worse year by year because of climate change. That is scientifically proven. So, disaster drives conflict, conflict creates war, war creates emissions, emissions creates climate change creates a disaster creates conflict creates war creates emissions, emissions create climate change. You get the idea. We're going around and around in a circle, and it's never ending. These two things feed into each other to just create this non-stop, ever-growing monster. And war will only get worse and more frequent and involve more people the more that we ignore climate change. It is in the best interest of defense and stopping war and world peace to curb emissions now. I mean, curb emissions in the 60s, curb emissions 100 years ago, but at the bare minimum, curb them now. But of course, the US war machine and defense contractors don't want us to stop war because that's how they make money. So what does the future of the climate movement look like? I've said it before and I'll say it again. We need to make climate change popular for everybody to care about. Everybody needs to care about climate change. I'm not saying you have to like take to the streets and protest and get a degree in environmental science, but you just need to care. You need to make that your main voting priority. Because look back to those first few presidents that we covered in today's video. They didn't necessarily care about the climate. They took climate action because it was popular at the time. It was mostly a bipartisan issue amongst voters in the mid-century, and look what came of it. Both Democrat and Republican, and I'm sure independents at the time, did climate policy. They established environmental agencies, they protected public lands, they wanted to curb emissions, and they did this because it was popular and not divisive. So talk about climate change, and maybe don't use those exact words because they are loaded and they are political now. So instead, talk about public lands because everybody loves to get outside. Talk about clean air because we all need it to breathe. You get the idea. Make environmentalism popular and mainstream because all it takes to be an environmentalist is to care about the planet. That is literally it. And in the digital age, it is easier and easier to spread the word about climate change and also spot propaganda. So pay attention and stay informed. Can we make climate change a nonpartisan issue yet again? I think we're going to have to, either willingly or in a few years, now, when everybody's facing the impacts of climate change and it finally hits them in the face, that's what they are facing. It still blows my mind that we're experiencing these once in 100-year floods every single year in so many different parts of the country, and once in 100-year fires and once in 100-year XYZ disaster every single year across the globe, but especially in the US. And people still will not recognize that that is climate change, making these disasters worse and worse. And again, it comes back to demonizing science. Demonizing science as early as Reagan, but probably before, through Bush Sr., through Bush Jr., and then with Trump 1 and Trump 2.0, demonizing all science. Now nobody trusts any scientists, which is so stupid. Science is the only thing that we can actually trust. Whether we can see it with the naked eye or not, climate change is here and it impacts us every day. It's our smokier air, our hotter summers, our more intense weather patterns, our more frequent natural disasters, it's climate refugees, it's inflation as crops are becoming harder to grow, and so much more. And yeah, right now under Trump 2.0, I can't say I have a whole lot of hope for making climate change popular again, or a lot of hope for the broad acceptance of science. He's mirroring what Reagan did in the 80s and somehow driving that wedge even further. The future is scary, I'll admit, but we have bounced back before. I like to think that, humans have overcome so many different obstacles and so many different tragedies in the past, but of course they didn't have climate change looming over them. So that does give me some worry. But we have to fight for our planet, we have to have hope, we have to keep trying. I know that this is not necessarily my happiest video, it's not really a video that's got you like some action items to take at the end of it. This was really just broadly for educational purposes, most of it being my own broad interest. I read that line in that book and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to research this further. And did I go in the rabbit hole of all these presidents? I now know so much about these presidents. And then I went down the rabbit hole of history of the Middle East and barely brushed the surface on either of these things. I hope that you enjoyed this video and I hope that you like learning as well. Again, all the sources are in this blog post, linked down below. And yeah, we stopped at Bush Jr., but we've got Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. If you want me to cover them, their climate policy, what does that look like and how we might be able to predict what future climate policy might be, let me know. But for now, I do have this video all about how Trump is destroying the planet one executive order at a time. I filmed that in January. It's just gotten worse since. So if you want an update on Trump and the planet, let me know. Thank you for caring about climate change. Thank you for caring about our planet. I encourage you to inspire others to do the same. If I have cards left, you can check out this video about how you can inspire others. If not, it's tagged down below. Ultimately, I think the best thing that we can do right now in an administration that is doing so much to demonize science, especially climate science, is to keep trying our best, keep educating and inspiring others. Thank you for watching this very long video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I will see you in the next one, but until then, remember that your small actions make a big difference in the long run. Bye guys. During his term, he signed in NOAA estimates that the Montreal Protocol prevented between 0.0. Oh my gosh. NOAA estimate. He also increased regulations. That's not a word.